The role of rehabilitation in the justice system continues to be one of the most controversial subjects relating to law and criminology. This is especially true when considering the worst kinds of violent crime, where the consequences of prematurely releasing violent offenders has the potential not only to result in further tragedy, but has the added effect of making many in society feel less safe. Though much has been learned in the past few decades about what drives people to become repeat offenders, allowing many former inmates to successfully reintegrate back into society, there are also deeply troubling times when authorities have missed glaring warning signs, allowing truly dangerous people back onto the streets. Today, we wanted to take a look at a few examples of such cases, focusing on violent offenders who were shockingly released from prison early, only to continue committing unspeakable crimes. Before we get to our list, don't forget to subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos. With that out of the way, here are 5 paroled murderers who went on to kill again. On January 10, 1979, Albert and Sandra Flick's tumultuous marriage looked as if it was finally coming to an end. After serving her husband with divorce papers, Sandra had Albert escorted by police from their apartment in Westbrook, Maine. However, Flick reportedly refused to accept that the relationship was over, continuing to return to the property and argue with Sandra about the divorce and the custody of their children. On the morning of January 31st, Flick drove to the apartment one final time, a prearranged visit to collect the rest of his belongings. He brought with him a gun and a 3.5-inch jackknife. Upon entering, Flick asked about some of the fishing rods he had left there. When Sandra brought them over, Flick removed his knife under the guise of showing her how to remove the hooks. When she bent over to look, Flick pulled her arm behind her back and put his hand around her mouth, pushing her over to a chair. Unknown to Flick was that Elsie Kimball, Sandra's daughter from a previous marriage, was in the back bedroom, watching the attack unfold. She ran from the apartment to get help, calling the police from the safety of a neighbor's unit. The neighbor's husband then witnessed Flick running from the apartment, his hands and clothes covered in blood. When police arrived, Sandra was dead. She had suffered numerous stab wounds to her neck and chest. The knife was found on the floor of the apartment. Flick was sentenced to 30 years at the Maine State Prison, but was released almost a decade early in October of 2000 for good behavior. According to the state's Department of Corrections, he continued to cycle in and out of prison after this, serving time twice for assaulting different women. In the second attack in 2010, Flick had repeatedly hit a woman with the butt of a knife, proceeding to chase her with a screwdriver before she managed to get away. Though it was argued by the prosecutor that Flick's violent behavior was unlikely to change and that the judge should impose a longer sentence, Flick again spent less than 4 years in prison. The judge argued that by the time of his release, Flick would be too old to be a threat to the public. Upon getting out in 2014, he immediately threatened the woman he had previously assaulted, landing him back in jail until 2016. Sadly, the crimes of Albert Flick would not be stopped until he claimed the life of another victim. On July 15, 2018, he murdered 48-year-old mother of 2 Kimberly Dobby in broad daylight. Flick had become obsessed with the woman, who had made it known she did not share his feelings. Flick was caught on CCTV camera following Dobby to a laundromat, where he stabbed her at least 10 times. The following year, it took a jury just 40 minutes to find Flick guilty of murder. On August 9, 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison at the age of 77.
On the night of August 6, 1966, 16-year-old Edna Louise Sullivan, her boyfriend Robert Brand, and Brand's 15-year-old cousin Mark Dunman were hanging out near their car on a baseball diamond in Everman, Texas. At around 10 p.m., another vehicle pulled up and parked approximately 150 yards away. Behind the wheel was a man named Kenneth Allen McDuff. McDuff exited the car with another man named Roy Green, and the two proceeded to walk over to the group of teens. McDuff brandished his .38 Colt revolver at them before telling them to get into the trunk of their car. He then drove the vehicle a short distance down the highway before pulling into a field, with Green following closely behind in McDuff's Dodge Coronet. Once in the secluded area, McDuff instructed Green to take Edna out of the trunk and put her in the back of the Coronet. Before joining his accomplice, he fired 6 shots into the trunk of the teenager's car, killing Robert and Mark. Green and McDuff then drove Edna Sullivan to a second location where they proceeded to rape her multiple times. When the violent sexual assault had ended, McDuff strangled the young girl with a 3-foot-long piece of broomstick. Though the two initially worked together to cover their tracks, Green turned himself into police a few days later, implicating McDuff in the crime. After his arrest and conviction, McDuff was sentenced to death in Texas's electric chair. Under normal circumstances, this might have been the end of the story. However, while he was awaiting execution in 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court made a surprise decision in the case of Furman v. Georgia. The ruling effectively outlawed the death penalty in the country until states could satisfactorily meet the requirements of the Eighth Amendment and required a degree of consistency in the application of legal executions. As a result, McDuff's sentence was commuted to life in prison, and he was shockingly granted parole in 1989 due to prison overcrowding. After his release, McDuff would go on to murder at least 6 more women. However, the true total may be much higher. It is widely believed that he began killing again within 3 days of his release. Though he was briefly returned to prison for a parole violation, he was set free shortly afterwards and allowed to continue his vicious killing spree. It wasn't until May of 1992 that McDuff was finally charged for any of the murders he had committed after his 1989 release, when he was arrested for the killing of 22-year-old Melissa Northrup. By this time, the death penalty had been reinstated in Texas, and McDuff was ultimately executed on October 17, 1998.
David Edward Maust had a childhood that was littered with tragedy and warning signs of later violence. After being abandoned by his father at the age of 7, he was left with his mentally unfit mother, who was once described by a social worker as needy, psychotic, and narcissistic. Maust's mother placed him in a psychiatric institution when he was just 9 years old, where he was confined until the age of 13. Though it appears Maust indeed displayed violent tendencies as a child, there are also reports that his mother dropped him off at the institution simply because she didn't want to take care of him. Once telling staff, she, quote, just doesn't want him at home. After leaving the hospital, Maust spent some time in a children's home, where he was reportedly subjected to sexual abuse at the hands of another boy. After spending a few years moving from place to place, he attempted to return to his mother's house at the age of 18, but was instead forced to enlist in the army. In 1974, while stationed in Germany, Maust would claim the life of his first victim, a 13-year-old boy named James McClister. Maust said that the death had resulted from an accident on a moped which he had stolen. However, his own diary entries years later would refute this. Disturbed by his sexual relationship with the boy, Maust wrote that he took McClister out into the middle of the woods and beat him to death. He was court-martialed and convicted of manslaughter and larceny, sentenced to 4 years at Fort Leavenworth. When Maust was up for early parole in 1977, he objected. It would not be the last time he would attempt to stay behind bars. However, his wishes were ignored, and he was released. In 1980, Maust was tried for the attempted murder of a friend in his Chicago apartment, but lied on the witness stand and was found not guilty. Just a year later, he would claim the life of his second victim, 15-year-old Donald Jones. He lured the young boy into his car, driving him to the Elgin Quarry, where he stabbed him in the stomach before drowning him. However, he was not caught until he committed yet another assault, this time on a 14-year-old boy in Texas. While serving 5 years for that crime, he was extradited to Illinois to stand trial for the murder of Donald Jones. Maust would spend the next 10 years in a mixture of jails and psychiatric units, before finally being convicted of the murder in 1994, pleading guilty and receiving 35 years. In 1999, after serving 17 years altogether and getting credit for good behavior, Maust was once again released from prison. Leading up to this, several people attempted to warn the Illinois Department of Corrections that it was a bad idea, including Maust himself, who wrote a 5-page letter to the department requesting to stay in prison. However, staff noted that under the law, he was eligible for release and did not meet the criteria to be placed in any other kind of facility. Reflecting on the decision years later, Maust would write, quote, "When I got locked up in the army, and then especially when I got locked up in 1981, I knew I should never be let out again. I didn't know how to act around other people, and I was never taught how to make friends and keep them. When an inmate says he doesn't want out, I hope that somebody listens." Tragically, Maust would go on to commit several more assaults and at least 3 additional murders after his 1999 release. He was arrested for the last time in December of 2003 for the strangling death of 16-year-old James Regagni, whose body was discovered encased in concrete in the basement of Maust's home in Hammond, Indiana. In November of 2005, he was sentenced to 3 life terms. Maust would commit suicide in his jail cell just 2 months later, leaving behind a note confessing to even more murders and apologizing to his victims' families.
In 1974, William Suff and his wife Terrell were convicted of the murder of their 2-month-old daughter. Though Terrell's conviction was later overturned, there was no doubt as to her husband's involvement. He had been frequently violent with the infant as well as the couple's 21-month-old son, the attacks reportedly resulting from Suff's uncontrollable fits of rage. According to court documents, a witness recalled seeing the children with multiple bruises and other injuries the week before the brutal killing. On the day the murder took place, Terrell reportedly went to work at 8 a.m., leaving her husband alone with their 2 children. Around noon, she received a call from Suff stating that something had happened to the baby. She returned to find the child dead. An autopsy revealed that the cause of death was a sharp blow to the abdomen that had ruptured the liver and resulted in massive bleeding. Also noted were several pre-existing injuries, including a partially healed broken arm and 13 broken ribs. Though Suff was sentenced to 70 years in prison for the heinous crime, he served just 10. After being granted parole in 1984, Suff quietly blended into the background for several years, taking a job as a government stock clerk in California. But the violence that put him behind bars would soon emerge once again, this time claiming the lives of many more innocent people. Between June of 1989 and December of 1991, Suff was responsible for the rape, torture, and murder of at least 12 women in Riverside County, California. He was known for both strangling and stabbing his victims, sometimes mutilating the bodies after the killings. Suff was arrested by pure coincidence in January of 1992 after police found a bloody knife and other suspicious objects in his van at a routine traffic stop. Though he was convicted for 12 murders at trial, it is believed he may have killed almost twice as many people. Reportedly, it only took the jury 10 minutes to arrive at their guilty verdict. William Suff currently resides at San Quentin State Prison, where he has been awaiting execution since 1995.
Arthur Shawcross might never have earned the nickname the Genesee River Killer if he wasn't granted early parole for 2 brutal murders. While he was reportedly the victim of severe sexual abuse as a young boy that caused him to act out violently, it was when he returned from his service in the Vietnam War that his antisocial behaviors began to manifest themselves in serious criminality. After briefly serving time for a string of arsons and burglaries, he was released from prison for the first time in October of 1971, returning to his childhood hometown of Watertown, New York. While in Watertown, Shawcross worked as a handyman in the Public Works Department, spending much of his free time fishing in the creeks and rivers around the city. This reportedly helped him to get to know many of the local children, which he would later exploit to commit terrible crimes. On the morning of May 7, 1972, a 10-year-old boy named Jack Owen Blake went out to play and never returned home. Though Jack's mother knew Shawcross had taken an interest in her son previously, when she questioned him about the disappearance, he said he knew nothing. As there was no evidence tying Shawcross to the missing boy at the time, the search continued. The horrifying truth was learned just a few months later, when Jack's remains were found in some woods just 3 days after the body of 8-year-old Karen Hill was also discovered. Both children had been sexually assaulted before being murdered and mutilated. Luckily, Shawcross was spotted near a bridge close to the second crime scene on the day Karen Hill had gone missing, and was quickly arrested. In exchange for admitting guilt, he was allowed to plead to the lesser charge of first-degree manslaughter in both killings, and was sentenced to a maximum of 25 years in prison. However, after only 14 years, prison staff and social workers concluded that Shawcross was no longer a danger to society, and he was granted parole in April of 1987. This decision was made against the advice of psychiatrists, who had designated him a schizoid psychopath. Starting in 1988, Shawcross would go on to commit at least 11 more brutal murders. Unable to control his urge to kill, he was eventually caught in early 1990, this time spending the rest of his life in prison for his crimes. He died in 2008. That brings us to the end of our list. Know of any other stories like this that you think we should consider for a future video? Tell us about them in the comments section below. As always, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos. Thank you for watching.